So the first question that we're going to explore today is, what are the distinctive features of postmodern legal theories, and what contribution do such theories make to our understanding of law? So the first question that we should start with, and it's very useful to set out some of the defining features of postmodern legal theories before we go on to exploring the implications that might arise or flow on from that. So like feminism, which we'll be exploring next week in more detail, postmodernism can be defined in various ways. However, as an inherently reactionary movement, so it arose, its main purpose was to fight against or in opposition against another philosophy, which was modernism. It's perhaps best to approach it by reference to modernism. Postmodernism evolved in the context of Western philosophy in the late 19th century. It is characterized by skepticism, subjectivism, and a general suspicion of reason and logic. So faith in human rationality is a characteristic attribute of modernism, but this is what is being reacted against in the postmodern philosophy. And so its basic ideological position and role it sees in itself is to assert and maintain political and economic power. Basically, that's it. So while modernism can be defined as the idea that human knowledge is moving closer to objective truths about the world and our place in it, postmodernism challenges this idea squarely. It denies the possibility of objective truth and therefore rejects the idea that we are making progress towards it. So modernism arose out of the Enlightenment in the 17th century and was premised on a commitment to objective reality where objects and properties were seen to exist logically independent of human thoughts, emotions, societies, and social practices. Rather, what it placed strong emphasis was on the role of logic and the role that reason had to play, as well as the sciences and advances in technology, as tools by which humans can further develop themselves and the society for the better. So they did believe in some sort of normative morality, I guess. In so doing, it bore a commitment to objective human nature insofar as it consists of faculties, aptitudes, proclivities or tendencies that we may naturally have, which may be present at birth, but also instilled later through education, as well as other social influences. By contrast, as we'll soon see, postmodernism holds that all aspects of human psychology is socially determined. So this idea of truth as a social construct lies at the heart of postmodern theory. Postmodernism replaces the idea of objective truth with the notion that all truths are socially constructed. What this means is that where modernism suggests that humans can overcome their social situation, postmodernism argues that all knowledge comes from our social environment. There is simply no higher source of truth out there. So historically, postmodernism arose first in the arts, music, and literature. And that's why my background today is this particular postmodern work of art by a postmodern artist. So I'll explain how this is a postmodern phenomenon. At the turn of the 19th century, we see postmodern thought affect arts. So we see Picasso's Cubism manifest itself, which was art as a projection of individual feeling and ultimately self-referential. We see Marcel Duchamp's deconstruction of Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, as you can see on the slide that I put up today. This is basically the whole methodology of postmodernism, which is a dismantling of the old. So we'll have a quick look at some of the implications that postmodernism has logically if we follow it to its logical conclusion. So if you think about modernism as being the force or philosophy that postmodernism was reacting against, let's have a think about what the default position might be if postmodernism itself is a purely reactionary movement without much of its own ontology or moral or normative basis. Then what would fill that gap by default? So if you basically situate postmodernism into the context of evolutionary theory, which it lies in the background of this whole period. So Charles Darwin introduced in his works Origin of Species was first published in 1857, at around the time that the precursors of postmodernism were writing. So we can see that this fills the gap in the dynamics of power, which is the closest to postmodern ontology, as I spoke of before. So if evolution holds survival as the goal for existence, and the strongest, smartest is most likely to survive and reproduce, animals with a stronger instinct, so instincts that are more conducive to self-preservation, are deemed to be the most successful. It therefore holds as central two main attributes in human nature. The first is the aggressive instinct, and the second is the sexual or reproductive instinct. Humans are at the top of the food chain or the evolutionary hierarchy because they have been the most successful predators. So in the absence of anything akin to a soul or conscience, which has been part of the old modernist idea, which was we can go all the way back to ancient Greek philosophy. They were developing this idea of conscience and the soul. If we do away with that, and in the absence of that broader cosmic or teleological order, we have our naked instincts for self-preservation, which is based on how aggressive we are or how sexual we are. Okay, so it boils down to power dynamic. At this point, we see one of the most seminal works appearing out of in the history of philosophy, in my opinion, and it's Nietzsche's Prescience. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche is famous for his philosophical and psychological works, and I think that a lot of people misunderstand him. I'm not saying that I have accurately understood him, but I do find him extremely thought-provoking. So it logically follows that the deconstruction of epistemology, which is philosophy of knowledge, and metaphysics, the philosophy of being or existence, leads to ethical relativism. Now, that's not questionable. It's not really an issue. However, it's worthwhile noting that many postmodernists will vehemently deny the relativist label. They don't see themselves as having relativist ontology, but logically, that's what happens. When you remove anything metaphysical, epistemological, moral, you're left with something where you see the world as being subject to many different types of interpretation. Truth is a construct. All of these terms is basically categorically relativist, correct? So we're removing the negative nuances of it. We're just being technical about it. It's a relativist standpoint when it comes to moral philosophy. Proponents deny that there are aspects of reality that are objective. There is truth. There is no such thing as true or false statements. And it's impossible for humans to know anything with any level of certitude. So there are many different types of interpretations available, and the prevailing discourse, and here we can see the link back to the evolutionary normative position, is in any given time in society reflects those interests and values of the dominant group. So in deconstructionist terms, this would be called privileging of the dominant discourse. Historically inspired by scholars such as Michel Foucault, this kind of relativism means that the discourses from the Enlightenment are not objective statements of facts, but rather engineered beliefs. And these ought to be changed because they are arbitrary and therefore unjustified. So later in the 80s and 90s of the last century, we see critical racist theory and feminism embrace these critiques of contemporary Western society and patriarchy is a word we commonly throw around these days. And that comes from a backdrop of postmodern theory. So although they don't officially own up to it, those who have studied this area of philosophy and seen the historical move know that this is what's behind what we know today as identity politics. Okay, so now let's turn to Friedrich Nietzsche. Parties on either side of the political debate, because he's so brilliant, will claim, so left or right, will claim him as supporting their positions. In fact, during World War II, Adolf Hitler was well known to carry around Nietzsche's works and consult them religiously. He said that Mein Kampf, his work, was inspired by Nietzsche. So Nazis make selective use of his philosophy, they all made selective use of his philosophy, and the same goes for modernist scholars, postmodern scholars. Everyone is always claiming Nietzsche as their own. Postmodernist scholars claim Nietzsche as the earliest postmodernist and commonly invoke him as the prophet of modernist thought. They admire him for his pathological as opposed to his scientific methodology which he used. But if you have a look at him, he was well across the dialectical method, which was used by the ancient Greek philosophers. And so I think if you don't have the proper education in that regard, you might misunderstand him as condoning a certain position where he's actually using an oscillation between two different positions to get closer to what he might figure out, or get closer to figuring out the truth, which is he's seemingly wanting to pursue. So the postmodernists particularly liked his acute ability to unmask certain social and philosophical guises, and it seemed to resonate with their deconstruction methodology. We'll attempt to consider him on his own terms today to see what he has to offer for postmodernism and like from a neutral perspective. Nietzsche was undoubtedly a brilliant scholar. He was a prolific writer, a vociferous reader. Born in Germany in 1844 and famous for his works on pathology, though he expressed a keen interest in philosophy. He argued that one of the most powerful forces in society was ressentiment, and that's what we're going to have a look at because I think it's squarely relevant to postmodern theory. So he talks about ressentiment in his work on the genealogy of morality in 1887 and systematically treats this in his very famous work, Beyond Good and Evil. And the closest English translation we can come to of this French term is something akin to a bitter resentment. So a vengefulness perhaps associated with feelings of envy, bitterness towards those who are better off than us or who have more power in society. And it's ultimately brings about a desire to tear those down whose power and privilege is greater than your own. So in this work, Nietzsche speaks about two types of moralities that flow on from this ressentiment. The first is the master morality. And the master morality is characterized by vigorous, life-loving, and being strong. It has like creativity as well, and optimism of life. The slave morality is the morality of the weak, the humble, and the victimized. The weak are generally afraid of the strong and become increasingly frustrated with their situation. They become envious and resentful of the strong and begin to harbor feelings of hatred towards themselves for not being able to stand up against the strong and for their own cowardice, I guess. But Nietzsche says that human beings cannot stay in the state of self-hatred for very long. So he posits that what happens next is that we weaker citizens start to invent a reality where we begin to rationalize that we are the good ones in the dichotomy, that our weakness is actually a moral rightness. And this must side with people, and then we start to side with people like ourselves, and we start to gather around and advocate for those who are weak and downtrodden and this is seen as morally justified. Because we've got rid of any external standard for objective morality, this is our morality now. So weak equates to right, and that's something that has an implication of postmodern theory. So according to this moral theory, the opposite of this is what is evil. The strong, the powerful, the physically and materially successful people. This eventually culminates in a lashing out at the weak against the strong by the weak. It doesn't take place through physical aggression because it is impossible, right? Because they are weaker. But usually the deconstruction happens through words. And so this is uncannily similar to deconstructionism, which started in language in postmodern theories. Deconstruction is obviously the reverse of constructionism. It's not about building something up from nothing, but tearing down something from what has already been built up. So morality in this sense is acutely self-referential. That is, the good, justice, and truth are determined by reference to our individual selves, and which is always, in our own minds, unique and rare. And this is the idea of the common good, or the idea of the common good, as we learned earlier in week 2 and 3, I think. Aristotelian human flourishing, eudaimonia, is just thrown out with the bathwater, I guess. So, for example, Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, one must shed the bad taste of wanting to agree with many. Good is no longer when one's neighbor mouths it. And how should there be a common good? The term contradicts itself. Whatever can be common always has little value. In the end, it must be as it is and always has been. Great things remain for the great. Abysses for the profound, nuances and shudders for the refined, and in brief, all that is rare for the rare. So he speaks in very poetic terms, Nietzsche, but that's his philosophical method, obviously. So let's break down now the postmodern methodology of deconstructionism. So it's, as I said, it started with language. So linguistic scholars were the first ones to develop this particular philosophy. Jean-Francois Lyotard, and I wrote on him in my work. I used this methodology to a international criminal law issue a few years ago, but he rejects the possibility of meta-narratives. So what does that mean? The implications of the rejection of meta-narratives. A meta-narrative can be defined as the overarching framework or theory that provides a yardstick for designating particular narratives or world views as true or false. So in other words, the notion of a meta-narrative suggests an absolute standard for judging truth or falsity of particular beliefs. Now, postmodernism rejects the possibility of such an all-encompassing framework and refutes the notion of this grand cosmic story. So instead of this, what postmodernists place a heavy emphasis on is the idea that there are many different narratives that are taking place at any given time that are a product of different socially constructed paradigms of thought and talking about the world. There is no absolute truth. Truth is created. Truth is made. Lyotard focuses on the role of language giving rise to narratives, and this is called language games. The deconstruction, therefore, lies at the core and is the core method of dismantling present and power structures and lies at the core of postmodern theory. So Lyotard comes up with the notion of the different. Now, I thought the different was a very valuable and useful methodology that comes out of postmodern theory. It imports an explicitly ethical element. So if you take the ontology aside, put that aside, and you see it just on the virtue of the methodology itself, it can be quite useful. The different is about genres of discourses. So we admit that there are many genres of discourses in any given context, which may prevent people who are operating under a different set of linguistic convention from making their viewpoints heard. So a person whose arguments are legitimized by the dominant genre of discourse will prevail, while other views will fall into the background or and ultimately be failed to be recognized. For example, in a context where the discourse is legal language, a person who wishes to defend themselves, and I'll say herself in this instance, but she has not been legally trained. Even though the proceedings are conducted in her native language, her point may still not be heard because she's not using the right jargon. In this case, it would be legalese, correct? And so I guess pre-studying law, we've all been through this, and we know the kind of issues that might confront us when we're not able to use the linkages that we have now learned through studying law. And in that sense, we don't have the full sense of a legitimate argument that we may have had, like akin to someone who has gone through a legal education and has access to that discourse. So that's what the differend is basically referring to. And it can be much worse than that example. So in such a situation, differend, the wrong perpetrated against this person fails to exist because it cannot be said, it cannot be spoken, it cannot be spelled out. Because within that specific genre of judgment, the words do not exist, right? So I use my comfort woman to basically demonstrate that, because during World War II, there were 200 around approximately, we're not so sure, it could have been up to 400,000, scholars estimate, but there were 200,000 women between the ages of, say, 11 and 21 who were abducted from different countries that Japan was colonizing at the time. And 80% of those women were Korean comfort women. The reasons I do write up in my writings, which is quite too horrific to really spell out here. But what happened is those women, they were never recognized as being raped over and over again in this systematic manner, where the country and those who were in the powerful country, Japan, took people from colonies. As I said, women as young as 11 were abducted from their homes, because later on the narrative changed. Later on, the narrative that was given was that they volunteered to go and join the military because they were paid. And so they were deemed comfort women, so women who gave comfort to soldiers at the front lines, as opposed, was a euphemism basically for these women who were rape victims. And it happened over a long period of time, and a lot of them failed to survive, obviously. The survivors came and returned, but then what happened was a lot of the countries were ashamed of the situation and later on only used them in terms of furthering their nationalist ideals as well. So their real stories as victims, as individual victims, was buried under these dominant discourses that prevailed over and prevented them from accessing the linkage to communicate the wrong that was done to them. And that's called the differend. The first wrong that was done to them, and it's called the double bind, because the first wrong that was done to them was obviously they were abducted and raped repeatedly. And these women clearly were violated. And so that is the first wrong. That's the crime done to them. The second wrong, and that's why it's called the double bind, is the fact that they did not have recourse, like access to recourse. They were not able to voice the wrong. So it's a double bind injustice. So that's an interesting way of viewing certain types of criminal offenses that might occur, and from a victim's perspective. So this can be quite useful. So the indeterminacy of legal questions, postmodern legal theories apply this picture to legal institutions. They typically reject the idea of objective answers to legal questions. Rather, they hold that legal questions are radically indeterminate. Law draws its content from language, but linguistic meaning is defined only by reference to other meanings. And this network of meanings is in a constant state of flux, making legal answers hard to pin down. So this is when it starts to get a bit nihilistic and fatalistic. And so if we don't believe that there is a right answer, what is justice then at that point? If we don't believe that it is worth pursuing something for the sake of finding the objective truth, then it might just be a completely failed endeavor from the get-go. So this is when it becomes a bit problematic. So they say there is no meaning outside of context. What this means is that from a postmodern perspective, we are hostages to our social context. Derrida claims there is nothing outside context. This is when critics argue that it's nihilistic in its morality. It's a radical postulation, but it can be seen as liberating at the beginning to realize that our social reality may not hold any objective truths. The problem is that this realization can also be quite disempowering once we realize that there's nothing outside our social reality that we can use to actually critique what's going on. If there is no objective yardstick, we are bound by the things we cannot really critique, right? Things are always happening to us. Things are always going on. And we just have to be as vocal as possible. And we just have to tear as many things down as possible so that we can just get ahead. And that's why it can be a bit destructive in its method. So let's reflect on the postmodern claim that there are no objective truths. Now, it's widely accepted that at least some truths are socially constructed, but does that mean that there are no claims that hold true outside our social environment? And in so doing, does postmodernism offer a fruitful method of legal critique, or does it ultimately, as I said, be in danger of leading to fatalism or quietism, since no external critique is possible? So eventually we yabba and yabba away, and then we're buried and we fade away in silence. So what's the end game? What's the purpose? Let's have a look at the value of postmodernism in legal theory. Deconstruction as a methodology. At first instance, we see that postmodernism seems critical of all theories and values to precede it. If all value is socially constructed, then the only values available to us are those reflected in existing social narratives. However, any choice to embrace those socially constructed values risks simply reaffirming the prevailing distributions of social power. So what some theorists have done to overcome this dilemma is by emphasizing the methodological aspects of postmodernism, as I have done. So we look at the methodology of, Derrida, the double bind, that kind of, deconstruction within a certain limited context. And this might work. This approach, in very basic terms, limits us to exposing and contrasting different contradictory narratives subsumed within traditional accounts of truth and knowledge. This might work to better understand the people who are too weak to speak for themselves, and who do not have the linguistic tools to be able to spell out their own narrative. And this may be one way to enable theorists to expose the way that social power structures systematically and arbitrarily privilege some unworthy recipients at the expense of others, and allow a systematic form of oppression and exploitation to occur without criticism or critique. So it can be very useful in that context and circumscribed situations, used to expose it and then limit it to that within a broader framework of understanding that there is such a thing as justice, that there is such a thing as truth that we pursue. And that way we can use the tools without having to accept wholesale its ontology, which is rather non-existent and basically based on power itself. And so it's a self-perpetuating destructiveness. Another thing that's important to note about postmodernism, if you accept it wholesale, is that often when they attack the power structures, you could lead to throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So the purpose is, and the goal is solely to dismantle the system. There is nothing it is trying to build or preserve. And so what happens is that you just destroy everything, and then what happens next? So that's always the question. So I think I'll finish on this idea of the value of silences, so that what we can draw out of the postmodern theory for law and justice is that it promises to draw attention to what Lyotard calls deference, which is these situations that I talked about where there is no linkage to voice the wrong. And this is done by exposing the perspectives that are silent or backgrounded within dominant meta-narratives. So there is a forward-looking dimension insofar as we're talking about this value of silences to the project of postmodernism. Deconstruction functions to draw attention to the ways of thinking about the world that have previously been marginalized or backgrounded. It gives voice to silences and in this way enables us to see the bigger picture and truth as it actually stands at a given time. And so insofar as that methodology, we can say that we can benefit greatly from postmodern critiques of language, postmodern critiques of law. And I think that that's how I will end this week's workshop.
Thank you, Constance. That was, wow, that's probably the deepest lecture that we've had, actually.
Thank you, Robin. I am very passionate about this subject because everywhere you see it in the world at the moment. It's a great tool to be able to see what's going on as well, see through the guises. And I think that's why I would recommend any of you who is interested to read Nietzsche. He can be quite confusing because he does talk in poetic language. But if you up to the challenge, that's, I think, very rewarding. And if anything that you can take out of learning.
It's interesting that it sort of has a contemporary spin on a lot of, you can look on to their philosophies and you can go, wow, there's some really contemporary modern sort of spin on some of it, really. There's a few things that were obvious tonight, but yeah, that was a pretty deep lecture.
See you next week for Feminist Critiques.
Thank you,
Constance. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.